Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I'm very excited to have Lynn Jensen joining me today. Lynn created her Yoga for Fertility program in 2002 after dealing with her own fertility challenges. So we're going to talk about yoga for fertility. And can it really boost success rates? What brought you to yoga?
I started practicing yoga when I was living in Japan in my mid-20s. And then when I came back to the States to go to graduate school, I found a yoga teacher and just continued to practice. And really the yoga became such a lifeline for me when I started this really super stressful job. I was doing yoga in airports, in hotel rooms. So it really was so helpful in that stressful lifestyle.
Yeah, and I hear that from my patients as well. So I'm glad you're here to talk to us about that. And how did your own fertility journey influence or impact how you teach?
We started to try for family when I was in my early 30s, thinking that it would be easy, like everyone thinks, and it wasn't. After several years of trying, we finally ended up doing like all of the things. We did IUIs, we did IVF cycles, I did a stretch on Lupron to try to control my endometriosis. We had a long journey with fertility, and it's actually helpful now because I understand what my students are going through and because many students in my classes are doing fertility treatments. But during all of that, I was continuing to do my yoga practice regularly. And what I noticed was that I had a couple other friends who were going through similar fertility treatments at the time. And I just noticed that I was on a lot more even keel than they were with this fertility process. After about 6 years of trying to conceive, we switched gears and went to our next plan, which was to go down the adoption track. And when we did that, everything shifted, in fact. And 3 months later, I had my baby son at home with us. Then when he was about 2, I started to think about, in hindsight, the yoga practice that I was doing during all that time was a pretty strenuous practice and really wasn't the most supportive thing that I could have been doing from a fertility standpoint. So I started to think, even though I didn't end up conceiving, that the yoga was super helpful during the process. And could there be some kind of yoga that was specifically designed to help women who are trying to conceive? And so I started doing a lot of research around that. By this time, I was certified as a yoga teacher, and I put together a program which would be supportive for people who were trying to conceive. And so that's the program that I launched in 2002.
And I'd love to hear more about how and why can yoga help with fertility?
There are a lot of ways that yoga is going to help. So some of those are physically by increasing the blood flow and the energy flow to the pelvic area and the reproductive organs. Also, yoga supports the regulation of the endocrine system, helping to regulate hormone levels. We put a lot of emphasis in my classes on stress reduction and activating the parasympathetic nervous system and just helping people get out of that fight or flight mode, which a lot of people spend a lot of time in. Reducing the level of stress hormones, I think, is super important for anyone going through this process because it's just a super stressful process, as we all know. And then we also work on mental and emotional levels also because yoga calms the mind, it reduces anxiety, which I find that a lot of my students have a lot of anxiety. It's been shown to increase levels of the neurotransmitter GABA, which is that calming neurotransmitter. Yoga helps to create this two-way communication channel between the mind and the body. So a lot of times I see women who've been dealing with fertility challenges for a long time, they've cut that off, right? Their body's not doing what they want it to do. And so there's not much receiving back and forth. And it's really important from a fertility standpoint that you're able to get the messages from your body. So it's not just a one way, the mind telling the body what to do, but the body can actually have some feedback about that. And then finally, for my classes, the emotional support piece is also really important. We always do a check-in. I do a lot to make it a community in the class. And people really, really value that they're now with this group of women who's going through really similar things and are super supportive.
That's all wonderful. And I'm so glad that you're bringing light to this. A lot of my patients ask me, like, is it okay for me to do yoga while I'm in my fertility treatment, whether it's IUI, IVF, or FAT cycles? What do you think?
Absolutely. On average, at any given time in my weekly classes, could be 60%, 70% of the students are doing one of those treatments. We do have to modify sometimes. And that's part of, in my classes, we do a check-in at the beginning of class. So particularly we need to pay attention if somebody's on stim drugs, obviously, or just recently post-retrieval, or just immediately post-transfer for a few days post-transfer. We need to really modify things. But other than that, mostly, because my classes are super gentle anyway, we can mostly all do the same things. We do things a little more gently in the second half of the cycle than somebody who's in the first half and trying to boost their ovaries up. So occasionally there will be poses that I'm doing that I say, okay, if you're first half of the cycle, you do this. If your second half, you do something slightly different.
And then how do you bring yoga philosophy into your yoga for fertility classes?
I do like to bring in some of the concepts that are more Eastern in nature, because some of these things are not things that we're aware of in our Western culture. I usually bring in a theme every week for my classes, and sometimes it's a theme to bring in one of these concepts. It's a little more from an Eastern perspective. And I'll just give an example of one that I like to talk about. And it's a concept called Jing from Chinese medicine. Jing essentially translates as life essence. And in the Chinese medicine understanding of it, it's that we're born with a certain amount of Jing. And over our lifetimes, we use that up especially by doing stressful things, by being in difficult relationships, by having a poor diet. I tell my students, really, it's your debit card, right? You can't just keep using it, taking it out, taking it out. At some point, you need to put back. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a big deficit. There are things that you can do to restore that Jing, to put it back into your Jing account. Those are things like yoga, like meditation, like walking in nature, spending time with people you love, with your pet. Those things are Jing enhancing. And if we're trying to conceive, that's a time when we really need our life essence to be strong.
I love this. When patients ask me about embryo transfer and how to prepare, I think now I'll just say, make sure your life essence is very strong. Because basically what I'm also trying to say, make sure your stress is low, you're sleeping well, you're feeling good, your relationships are sound, but truly just making sure your life essence is strong basically captures all of that. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience today?
There are a few things that I see pretty frequently that I see as obstacles that my students are dealing with. And they are things that yoga can help with. And often there are things like overthinking the process, trying to apply their normal analytical planning, organizing, micromanaging skills to this fertility process. And this, as we know, fertility process is non-linear. It doesn't go in a nice straight line, and more thinking and more researching is generally not that helpful. So these are things that yoga can help shift our mindset around it to one where instead of this is something we're trying to achieve this pregnancy, that actually what we're trying to do is receive it. And that's a very different mindset and a very different way to approach it. So these are things where I think bringing a yoga practice in can be super helpful to shift.
So I have many mantras and sayings, and just to help me with my daily life because of the amount of, you can imagine I take care of a lot of people who are under stress. And one of them is, if you believe it, you can achieve it. But when it comes to baby making, I agree. It should be, if you believe it, you should receive it.
I love it. That's beautiful. I might borrow your mantra from you with that little change.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amy.